Thank you. On behalf of Brother Norman and the entire St. Vincent College community, I do want to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this lecture this evening, and we're honored to have, proud and honored to have Steve Cortes here this evening at St. Vincent with us. Mr. Cortes received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University in 1994. He must have been quite a student and also quite a football player there. Georgetown nominated him for a Rhodes Scholarship upon his graduation. Stephen went on to found a financial research and counseling firm that provides expert investment assistance to a wide variety of significant clients. He is also a TV star, regularly appearing on CNBC News as an expert in financial investing. His new book, which is projected here on the screen, Against the Herd, 6 Contrarian Investment Strategies You Should Follow, has been widely and warmly received. I don't know which one of these is working. This is better. Besides all of the wonderful accomplishments, Steve Cortes is a man deserving of our great admiration for the tremendous personal sacrifice that he is making by being with us tonight. Steve is, you see, a die-hard Chicago Bears fan, and tonight the Bears play their most hated and bitter rival, the Green Bay Packers. Just to show you how deeply affected Steve is with the, infected that Steve is with the Chicago Bears, he's named his youngest child Bear. Now, of course, Steve, we Steeler fans have no great love for the Packers either. Ever since they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in our last Super Bowl. But at last, as far as we know, the Packers fans don't make the terrible jokes about the Steelers the same way that they make them about your beloved Chicago Bears. Steve, we understand how you feel as a Packers fan when they define the Chicago Bears as that group of 53 men who always sit around watching the Super Bowl on TV. Or when you ask one of them what you call a Chicago Bear who's wearing a Super Bowl ring, a burglar. Steve, we feel your pain. As your good friend Bill Clinton would have once said, we feel your pain. We also feel a closeness to you, even though we note that your education was under the direction of our dear brothers in Christ, the beloved Jesuits. For the benefit of people here who don't understand the basic difference between the Jesuits and the Benedictines, I will explain it to you in a very simple story. A young businessman approached a Jesuit and a Benedictine and asked how many novenas he would have to say in order to get a new Maserati. The Benedictine asked, "What's a Maserati?" The Jesuit asked, "What is a novena?" Steve, it's clear to me that you are much more simpatico with the Benedictines than you are with your former Jesuit professors. Our Benedictine order itself was founded by a man who was quite a contrarian. St. Benedict broke away from the trappings of Roman life to seek a simple and humble life as a hermit outside the city. The very founder of St. Vincent, Boniface Wimmer, certainly qualifies as someone who persevered against the herd in his celebrated life. As a missionary, he yearned to leave the safe and predictable existence in the community in which he grew up and come to meet the great challenges facing him in the New World. Boniface Wimmer's motto, "Forward, always forward, everywhere forward," was not one he adopted because he was following the herd. So Steve, perhaps you may be more Benedictine at heart, but if you have any doubts about that, there's just a little test that we can give you to help you as you make this determination. You might be a Benedictine if you never feel the need to accessorize your wardrobe. You just might be a Benedictine if you know that the word abbot is not always followed by the words Costello. You might be a Benedictine if you appreciate that 180 men living in one building did not necessarily mean that any of them are trying for parole. And you might be a Benedictine if you are particularly looking forward to a talk entitled, "When Going Against the Herd Can Pay Off," because we not only take a vow of poverty, we are unfortunately so often so good at accomplishing it. Let us now please give a warm Benedictine and St. Vincent welcome to our distinguished speaker, Steve Cortes.
Thank you very much, Archabbot. I appreciate that very warm welcome. I will tell you, I am Jesuit educated. My mother, bless her soul, I shouldn't say soul, she's alive, by the way, but still bless her soul, my mother was completely worried that going to Georgetown I would lose my faith. Thankfully that didn't happen. The Jesuits didn't accomplish that as she feared. I have become very close to the Benedictines recently, and particularly to the Archabbot, and I'm just so thrilled to be here, and also thrilled to be in this area. I'm from Chicago, as was mentioned, and I am a rabid Bears fan, but I have deep ties now by marriage here in western Pennsylvania. My wife's family is from just down the road in Ligonier, and my wife and children spend really all of summer here, and I am back and forth between TV appearances in New York and business in Chicago, but I spend a heck of a lot of time here, and as much as I can during the summer. So I love your area, I love the natural beauty, I love the people, and I also understand the language. I will tell you that when someone says, "Yin's gone down," I do not need a translator, as most Chicagoans would. I understand what they are talking about. I would also tell you, by the way, that although I'm a rabid Bears fan, if you notice from my book cover, it's Steelers colors. So please give me credit for that. Now, and I will tell you, so the Bears just kicked off against the hated Packers, so I will be brief. Hopefully, I will have incredibly pregnant remarks, but they will be quick. But no, in all seriousness, I want to delve into these topics, and I will be very happy to take your questions when I'm done. I'm going to focus mostly on the macro landscape of what I see in the world right now, but I'm very happy to get into more micro questions, things that are happening right now, day to day in the market, and I think Q&A might be a very good time to get into that. One last football reference. I will tell you another reason that I love Western Pennsylvania is that you gave us Mike Ditka. And Mike Ditka, I will tell you, in Chicago is the closest thing we have ever had to a walking messiah in the city of Chicago. He still to this day very much owns the town. And interestingly, I actually have a bit of a Ditka story to tell regarding the book. So when I was writing this book last year, it's the first and only book I've ever written, and I was going back and forth with my editor, and she was excellent. She was very young, 20-something. And my message about global financial markets, as you'll find out shortly if you haven't already heard me, is generally dour. I am not particularly optimistic about the near term, the next couple of years, in terms of financial markets. I think that the world, in large respect, is a mess financially and is going to get worse in some ways before it gets better. So my book, in large respect, is a dour book. It is a cynical, skeptical book in many ways. I am not a cynical, skeptical person, though, and so to try to lighten the book up a little bit and to try to enliven it, I put in it a ton of pop culture references. And so if you read it, you will see that it is just replete with references to movies and songs. The only problem is I was an adolescent in the 1980s. I'm 40 years old. And the editor said to me, these are great, they're funny. She said, every single one of them comes from the 1980s. She said, not everyone was an adolescent in the 80s. Many readers are older, some are younger. She said, Steve, the world didn't stop in 1986. And it was funny she picked that date. And I thought about it, and I said, well, in some ways, you're right, the world did not stop in 1986, but I liked the world a lot better when Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States and Mike Ditka was the coach of the Chicago Bears. And so she agreed and said, fine, I won't fight you any longer on the 1980s references. But I got this book deal only because of television, because I'm typically on, normally at noon Eastern time, on the Fast Money Halftime Report. And if you have seen me on that, by the way, most people who see me tell me they see me on the treadmill, working folks who are working out, so they see me on mute. They say, hey, it looked like you were saying something smart. And I said, well, what does that mean? Just that I had a nice tie on, I guess? But in any case, a lot of people watch me on mute at noontime. But if you have seen me and actually listened to me on the show, you will note that I am very often at odds with the rest of the panel. And they are almost always in complete agreement with each other. Now, I think it makes for some fun TV, but I think there's also some serious lessons to be learned from being a contrarian. And by the way, I will tell you, speaking of the fun part of TV, there's a lot of fun attributes to TV. I get great restaurant seating when I'm in New York City. Occasionally I get recognized. There's some bad parts too. I have been incredibly skeptical of Apple, which hit another all-time high today. I've been skeptical of it for a long time. Believe it or not, I've made money shorting it, but I've been very nimble in shorting it. But regardless, that doesn't matter. All people remember is that I said something bearish about Apple on the air, and I will tell you that Apple is a cult like no other. Apple stockholders. I have grandmas in the street flipping me the bird in Chicago, telling me, nice job on Apple, Cortes. Another funny negative story about television. As Arch Abbott mentioned, I have a young son named Bear, and he loves sports, and we play sports all the time. And he's a good athlete, but about every fifth time, say, we play a game, I make sure that I beat him because I don't want his head to get too big. He can't win every time. I let him win most of the time. Well, we were playing basketball just a couple weeks ago, and I beat him, and the kids love to make fun of me that on TV I wear makeup. And I beat him, and I'm like, hey, Bear, shake hands, and started walking away. I said, Bear, you had to shake my hand even though you lost. And he said, yeah, I lost, but I don't wear makeup, Dad. So, from the mouths of a 5-year-old. But getting to the book and to the message tonight, I wrote this book to try to be a book of empowerment for individual investors. I have had a front row seat for the last 17 years working on Wall Street, the last 15 years trading my own capital every single day, day in, day out. I run my own small firm, Veracruz LLC, and more recently, over the last 3 to 4 years, I've also had a front row seat on the financial media side of Wall Street. And I can tell you that I believe a more vigilant and more skeptical investor is a necessity, I believe, going forward to protecting capital and to responsibly growing capital. And I think the pain that was so prevalent in the recent financial crisis, and continues to this day, by the way, stocks have largely come back, but there are many assets that have not, and there are certainly millions and millions of jobs that have not returned with the pseudo-recovery that we're now experiencing. I believe that much of that pain was a direct result of far too much groupthink, of far too much following the herd, of far too much listening to the supposed experts on Wall Street and in the financial media. So, I am encouraging you through this book, which I hope is a message of empowerment, to be a contrarian thinker. Now, before I get a little more into that, let me tell you, how did I become a contrarian? I mentioned my mother before. She tells me sometimes, she says, contrarian, it just sounds like you're angry. You just want to disagree. It's not that. I will tell you that the contrarian awakening sort of for me was when many years ago I was still a young man. First time I ever went to Las Vegas. Was in a Las Vegas casino in the sports book. I put a bet down on Notre Dame. It seemed like I was the only guy there who had bet on Notre Dame. Late game rally, Notre Dame wins the game, covers the spread. I go up to the teller window in Las Vegas, and I look across, and it was as if he was out of a movie. There is an old, crotchety guy with a cigar visor looking over his reading glasses, and I came up and sort of meekly gave him my winning ticket, which was probably for about $5 at the time. And I said, wow, it sure seems like nobody had this game right. And he looked at me over those reading glasses and he said, son, I want you to always remember this. The masses are asses. And I said, you know what? They kind of are. And it dawned on me that if you look at history, particularly in terms of financial markets, following the herd has been incredibly dangerous, and for a very long time. Financial bubbles are not new. Historically, we can look at the Dutch tulip bubble. At one point in Amsterdam, certain varietal bulbs of tulips were worth more than an entire house before crashing. The UK had a South Sea bubble related to Tahiti and Polynesia. The United States had a Western Railroad bubble. that doesn't get very much attention. And then, of course, more recently, we had the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. So my message is to be skeptical, to do your own homework. I believe as an investor, you know more than you think, and conversely, Wall Street knows much less than you assume. Tell you another story of contrarian thinking and the danger in following the herd. If I were to ask folks, what is the worst tragedy, human tragedy in the history of Chicago? Even most Chicagoans would probably answer it's a Chicago fire. That was a tremendous property casualty scenario. However, very few people actually died in the Chicago fire, and they were mostly firemen. The fire spread very slowly. There was very little civilian death toll. But in 1915, the SS Eastland was a boat that docked in the Chicago River. It was taking the employees of the Western Electric Company on a company picnic to the shores across Lake Michigan on the beaches in Indiana. 2,700 people boarded the SS Eastland. There was a disturbance on shore in the Chicago River. No one knows exactly what to this day. Everyone at once rushed to one side of the boat, tipped the boat completely over, and in calm 20-foot waters in the Chicago River, a total of 844 men, women, and children drowned in the SS Eastland. The worst human tragedy in Chicago history and one of the worst maritime tragedies ever. Now, why do I share that dreadful tale? A couple of reasons. One is that when risk is not obvious, we don't take precautions. So if you are on a boat in raging seas, you are very likely to have a life jacket on. But in fact, the bathtub may be far more dangerous in terms of drowning than those raging seas. We also can be fooled when we are assured by so-called experts of safety. And an example of that, I think, is worth noting. It was in 2007, July of 2007, just as the housing crisis was beginning to gather steam. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, who we heard a lot from today, said at that time, quote, "Given the fundamentals in place that should support demand for housing, we believe the effect of the subprime sector on the broader housing market will be limited." That was spoken at S&P 1500 just as the world was about to implode financially. But it is highly ingrained in our psyche to seek safety in numbers. I would argue that it's even evolutionarily ingrained in our psyche. Safety in numbers might have actually provided real safety and comfort in the days where we faced predators in the wild. But in the financial markets, I think it can bring about incredible calamity. And by the way, I believe that financial bubbles are getting worse, both in their severity and in their rapidity. Why? Two reasons, I think. One is globalization. The synchronicity of global economies makes bubbles, in my view, worse and more prevalent. The second reason, I think, which is very much related, is social media. Twitter, Facebook are incredible forces, and on the whole have been incredible forces for economic growth. But they can also allow groupthink to quickly become globally accepted conventional wisdom, no matter how wrong that groupthink might be. So, if we look at the world now, that is my basis for being a contrarian. If we look at the world now, where is there unappreciated, unrecognized danger right now from here forward? Clearly no one, or few people I should say, not no one, few people foresaw the housing danger. What is the next housing type crisis facing the world? Where does that danger lie? And by the way, danger always brings about opportunity as well. So where does that concomitant opportunity lie as well? I suggest that that danger is in China. The whole world right now, from Wall Street to Main Street to most universities, are completely assured of two things: that China is the rising, ascendant, sure superpower, that it will be the dominant force in the coming decades, and certainly by the time our children are older. And the other side of that same coin is an assured belief in America's decline, that America economically is a country that has already started to deteriorate and lose global leadership. I'm here to tell you to disbelieve both of those. I believe China is already in the early stages of a crisis that might be so significant that it could result in a failed state in China. And I'm also here to tell you, and I'll get into details why, that America's power is young and it is growing. I see two main reasons that I'm going to delve into today, and I go into much greater detail, of course, in the book, but two main reasons today why China is the greatest global risk. The first is central planning. The second is the lack of innovation. Regarding central planning, Adam Smith, the great economist and philosopher, taught us about the invisible hand of commerce. Self-interested actors align into efficient, creative channels of business, and they achieve a remarkable harmony. He warned against the coercive and paradoxically inefficient idea of central planning, because no individual and no small group of individuals can possibly successfully for the long term manage the economic affairs of a country. But that is just what China has tried to do. And I would suggest to you, and this is a quote from Jim Chanos, who is a very famous hedge fund manager who shares many of my beliefs about China. He said, quote, "Adam Smith is going to get his revenge in China." I'd like to give a historical example, too. We've seen this before historically. Centrally planned economies can create incredible near-term growth. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union did this. And if you read your history books, in the 1950s, there was legitimate fear that the United States economically, not just militarily, economically was going to be passed by the Soviet Union because of how rapidly they were able to, with central command, industrialize their economy. It seems almost laughable now. But a more recent example from our lifetimes, not the college students here, but from my lifetime, is Japan in the 1980s. Japan's ascendance in the 1980s was no less assured to the average American than China's is now. In retrospect now, after 2 lost decades of Japanese stagnation and its market going nowhere but down, it seems almost laughable. But it wasn't laughable in the 1980s. At that time, Japan owned Pebble Beach. They owned Rockefeller Center. Everyone was rushing to major in Japanese in college. It seemed as though we would be lucky if we could one day, as Americans, work for a Japanese company. I think the same kinds of scenarios are now playing out for China. I'll tell you a story when I said about speaking Japanese. I was recently in New York at Sparks Steakhouse, which is a legendary place, mostly legendary because of mob hits that occurred there in the old days. These days, it's more of a place where Wall Street folks hang out. And I was at a dinner with 5 hedge fund managers, a few clients of mine and their friends. 6 of us around the table. Talk turned to China, as it often does these days in financial markets. Of the 6 of us there, I was the only one whose children were not studying Mandarin. I suggested to the table that given the demographics of the United States, it might make much more sense for the children to study Spanish rather than Mandarin, and I was somewhat politely dismissed as not realizing the future. My point is, when it becomes that unanimous, just as Japanese had in the 1980s and Mandarin is now, we know that we are starting to reach the end of a bubble, not the beginning of a growth story in China. Now, where does this central planning lead? The most dangerous thing it leads to in China is massive overcapacity. What do I mean by overcapacity? In other words, projects are not driven by a profit motive. They are built by a thirst for growth, period, at any cost, and by political expediency. There is a level of corruption in China right now that would embarrass a Chicago alderman. Because of this, we end up with bridges to nowhere, with ghost towns. I encourage you to, if you just put in China ghost towns in Google, you will come up with some frightening satellite pictures of towns like Ordos, which is in Mongolia or near Mongolia, which was built to house 1 million people and stands completely empty. These kinds of boondoggles, though, are not by any stretch rare. If we look at cement, China right now has spare capacity to produce cement that exceeds the entire cement production of the rest of the world. China has enough steel right now, presently, in inventories, has more steel in inventory than the entire steel production of the United States and Japan combined. I suggest to you that these are the signs of a bubble. And I'll show you a picture about the revenge of Adam Smith. This is the New South China Mall. It is the largest mall in the entire world. It has 3,000 stores. It is in the south of China in Dongguan. When it opened 2 years ago, the New York Times gushed, quote, "There is no end in sight and no evidence that China's long boom is likely to suffer anything more than a modest slowdown." Well, if you look at that picture, the place is 99% empty of retail. I would suggest that not only is there no end in sight, there are no people in sight because the entire boondoggle is empty. Central planning, though, is not just confined to these kinds of mega projects, these biblically sized infrastructure projects. Central planning in China actually reaches all the way into the family. China controls its population through the one-child policy. And by the way, China has a population problem. Only it's not the one you think. It is not too many people. It is very soon going to be too few. China has relied incredibly on its comparative advantage, which is China has taken the processes of the West, of America and Europe primarily, the products and designs, produced them more cheaply because it has had a seemingly inexhaustible supply of cheap labor, primarily coming from the west of the country into the urban areas of the east. However, that supply of people is quickly dissipating, largely because of the one-child policy. China is the most populous country in the world, but it is also the fastest aging country in the world because of the one-child policy. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why China has failed to develop a serious consumer market. The consumer percentage of Chinese GDP is only 34%, and it is declining, which is unprecedented in an emerging market. In an emerging market, the consumer is supposed to rapidly rise as a percentage of GDP. That has always been the case in every emerging market, except for China. The United States, the level is twice that. It's 70%. We're obviously a very developed market. Even the other BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, are all well north of 50% of their GDP being consumer-driven. Why is it not happening in China? It's because China's aging so quickly and they are having so few babies, and the savings rate is skyrocketing because the Chinese themselves know how old they are getting individually and as a society, and that they are losing this comparative advantage. I would also point out, so on this slide, let me first tell you, on this slide, so this is the total population, which is in the bars, and the annual growth rate, which is on the line. So you can see that the bars have been ascending for a long time. However, the projections are it is just about to crest and start heading lower because of the line, the growth rate, which has gone so low. I would also add, and this might be eventually the most dangerous aspect of all, of the one-child policy, is the gender mismatch, which is worsening in China. In many parts of China, there are now 1.3 men for every woman. Now, I know the Archabbot told us that 180 men live very peacefully here in a Benedictine monastery, but I would submit to you that that kind of surplus in men in a society is sure to have terrible consequences going forward. We really don't even know, because there are no analogs for it historically, to have this kind of a mismatch. But I would also suggest to you, the point of my speech today and my book is economics. It's not human rights. But the human rights affronts of China do have economic consequences. And I would also suggest to you that at a Catholic college, it is well worth considering not just the economic prospects of China, but the real tyranny of the Chinese regime, which again extends not just from central planning and economics, but all the way into family reproduction. Now, that tyranny also, excuse me, that was slide, yeah, it's fine. That tyranny also has created in China an incredible lack of innovation. I would challenge you, as much as China has grown, and it has grown 30 straight years without a recession, which is a remarkable run. However, it has grown primarily, again, by exploiting its advantage of workers, of cheap workers. an advantage that it's rapidly losing. I would challenge you, can you think of one product or one company from China that has been truly invented in China? Anyone? I can't think of one. I only know of copycats, and sometimes it's not just copycats, sometimes it's outright theft. So the lack of innovation in China, to me, which largely emanates from central planning, will be in the future and even presently one of the chief hurdles to Chinese growth. I'll give you a stat that I think flushes out this truth. The United States has 332 Nobel Prize winners. China has 2. One, the Dalai Lama, is in permanent exile from China. The other, Liu Zhibang, I'm probably not saying his name right, is in prison tonight as we speak in China. So 2 winners, both for peace, not for economics, not for science. One in prison, one would be in prison if he dared to enter the country. That's a lack of innovation. And again, it's not just a human rights affront, it is an innovation killer. When we look at the history of innovation, the fertile ground for innovation is openness. Leonardo da Vinci thrived in a Renaissance Europe. More recently, Sergey Brin founded Google in California, in Silicon Valley, and in the openness and transparency and vibrancy of Stanford University. Tyranny is never the recipe for innovation, and it hasn't been in China. Now, moving on to America. Enough bad news. The good book says, don't just curse the darkness, but light a candle. I'm going to light a candle and tell you that the inverse of this story about China, and I'm saying to disbelieve conventional wisdom on China, I think you should also doubt conventional wisdom on America. Conventional wisdom that we are a power in decline. And I'm going to talk about some of the investable takeaways from this belief. I think America, the opposite of China, is the young and growing power because of transparency and demographic growth. Now, in terms of transparency, I think our culture is incredibly important here. America has a culture of tinkering, a culture of failure and regeneration. This is a country of second and third and even 10th chances. I mentioned a couple of entrepreneurs earlier. I'll tell you one from about a century ago, Thomas Watson. He's the man who really built IBM. Thomas Watson was a failed butcher in Buffalo, New York. When his butcher shop failed, he went to take his NCR cash register back to the company. While he was there, he grew intrigued with the business and begged them for a job selling for NCR. He very soon became their top salesman, folded the company into IBM, and eventually, by the time he died, was one of the most successful capitalists in history and employed in his company, IBM, over 80,000 people at that point. Not bad for a failed butcher. But that is an American story. It's certainly not a story that happens in China, unless you are politically connected. And it's not even a story, really, that we hear very much from the rest of the industrial world. I would also point out that one of the reasons I think America is over-lawyered, my apologies to some of the lawyers here in the room, but America is an over-lawyered country. But one of the advantages to being as litigious as we are is that intellectual property is protected. So it's not just a culture of tinkering, of experimentation, of failure and regeneration. It's also that when you do find success, the law protects your success. There is no such protection in China right now. I'll give you a quick story. Zippo lighters. Zippo lighters manufactured in the United States. They produce 10 million a year. They have a guarantee on it, lights every time or we replace it for free, lifetime guarantee. The company lately has found that the main problem it's facing is how many fake rippos, as the company calls it is receiving back for repair because they were made in China and they weren't made nearly as well. China, the company tells us, is now making 10 million rippos per year. This is not a rare story in China. One of the reasons, by the way, that they are so cavalier about intellectual property is that they have so little, because of the lack of innovation, to enforce themselves. But thankfully, the United States is the antithesis of this reality. We don't have to go all the way back to Thomas Watson and IBM. We can talk much more recently. This is the country that did invent Google, as I mentioned, with a Russian immigrant, country that invented Amazon, Apple, the company that I get into so much trouble for talking against. We are the country at the forefront of biotechnology, nanotechnology, and I would also point out that we have maintained our economic might, believe it or not, very well relative to the rest of the world. For the last 40 years, America has had 25%, with remarkable consistency, 25% of total global GDP. I think very few Americans would realize that if I told them. And what that tells me is that the world actually rises and falls with the American economy, not the other way around. Now, China's share of global GDP has risen dramatically, particularly in the last 15 years or so, but that rise has come primarily at the expense of Europe. Asia has been eating the lunch of Europe, not the United States. Now, why? Other than our transparency, demographic growth. The reason I say that we are a young and growing power is because we are a young and growing people, quite literally. Along with Canada, we are the only industrial country in the world with a growing population, because we have a slightly better than replacement birth rate at 2.1 per woman, and on top of that, we throw in massive immigration. This stands in stark contrast not just to China, by the way, but to the rest of the industrial world. If you look at Italy, Spain, and Japan as examples, the average child born in those countries now has a completely vertical family tree. What do I mean by that? It means they have no siblings, no aunts and uncles. They have their parents and their grandparents. That is the average child in those countries. Well, I suggest to you that demography is destiny. And in the future, it will be controlled by not just who has people, but who has young people. Thankfully, America dominates in this regard. This slide is demographic growth. Who will have young workers? So this is the projected change starting in 2000, going all the way to 2050. And by the way, you might say, how can we project to 2050? One great thing about demographics, and one reason why I focus on it so much in my book, and I focus on it a lot in terms of trading strategies, demographics can be projected with remarkable accuracy. This is not like trying to project the S&P 500, which is incredibly difficult. Demographics move very slowly, and trends stay intact for a very long time. So I think this is an incredibly accurate representation, according to census data, of young workers into the future. The United States is in the green at the top of the chart, China is in the red, and Europe is in the gold. We can see that Europe has already crested in terms of its working age population and is about to start a precipitous decline because of that vertical family tree I just talked about. China, like its total population, is about to crest in terms of young workers. But in contrast, the United States is going to grow young workers far into the future. One of the reasons, by the way, is not just our growth rate, but as I mentioned, immigration. And I know this is a hot-button political issue for a lot of people. I will tell you from my vantage point economically, it is one of the cornerstones of America's strength, and I think it is absolutely one of the pillars that will ensure our continued economic dominance going forward, is the massive immigration that America enjoys. And when I say immigration, I mean at all levels, from the laborer who is sweating in the produce fields of Southern California to the graduate level PhD students who are studying at UPMC in a lab. America benefits, and the world is still coming to America. As successful as China has been, at least on its face, in recent decades, there is no queue of people looking to go into China. And in fact, quite the opposite. China Daily did a survey of wealthy Chinese and asked them, are they going to stay in China? Remarkably, 60% of wealthy Chinese said they plan on leaving China. Their money is already leaving. It's the worst performing stock market in the world this year. They're investing primarily in the United States, but all over the Pacific as well. Now they're saying they're going to leave with their feet. Imagine a parallel in U.S. history. China is roughly where we were in the Industrial Revolution, let's say in the 19-teens. When we experienced that kind of breakneck growth and industrialization. Can you imagine asking the wealthy of Pittsburgh at that time? Imagine asking the Mellons and the Fricks and the Carnegies, are you going to leave the United States? I believe the answer would have been 0%. No one would want to leave the United States, and they wouldn't be sending their capital overseas either. It's happening in China. Why? Because the Chinese people themselves see what I'm talking about, and they're already starting to reflect it in their asset prices. But again, thankfully, America is the other side of that coin. And I believe, by the way, if I'm correct about China, that a preponderance of their talent and capital is going to end up here. Immigration, in terms of its benefit to America, a couple of stats. 50% of all patents registered last year were to foreign-born Americans. 80% of all graduate students in mathematics in America are foreign-born. And last year, the Intel High School Science Search, which is the most prestigious high school talent contest in America, 7 of the 10 winners were the children of immigrants. So these immigrants bring their energy, their innovation, and their reproduction to America. And we reap untold benefits from it and will continue to. Now, bringing this down to investing. I believe that you want to, for those of you who aren't traders, I'm a trader. If you're a trader, I think you want to short China on rallies. And it's something I've been doing all year long. Most of you probably are not traders, though. If you are an investor, I think it is very important to avoid too much China exposure. And by the way, that's not easy, because the S&P 500 mega cap international companies have bought wholeheartedly into the China myth. It is rare that we have a CEO come on our show who does not completely extol the miraculous benefits of China and give us their growth strategy for China. So you have to be very picky to not get China exposure. But there are some names that are particularly exposed to China. Construction, names like Caterpillar. Mining, names like BHP Billiton. Even in restaurants, names like Yum, which owns Taco Bell, are incredibly China exposed. So there are many China plays. By the way, most of these names, not surprisingly, with China the weakest stock market in the world, most of these kinds of names have had very bad years so far, and in a year that's been great for the S&P 500. Ford Motor Company. For all the adulation from Washington over the supposed auto renaissance and turnaround, there has been no renaissance for the owners of those stocks over the last couple of years, and particularly this year. Ford Motor has traded disastrously. It is planning on investing $5 billion in China. So I suggest these are the kinds of names to avoid. Now, what to embrace? I think that you want to go for the double Ds. You want dividends and domesticity. Dividends. In an era with a 1.65% 10-year note, I think it's where it closed today. In any case, it's well below 2%. I believe interest rates are going to stay low for an incredibly long time. And I think largely because of China, which is an incredibly deflationary force in the world. If I'm right about that, then reasonable dividends from companies that can predictably pay a dividend are going to continue to be paramount in an investing strategy. I also believe in domesticity, companies that are more focused on the U.S. than the world, and particularly China. One company that I think holds both of those attributes is Walmart, which is a stock that I own presently. And again, I trade in and out, but I always basically trade Walmart from the long side. I also like utilities, which pay extremely high dividends, and utilities, by definition, are domestic. Some of them have some very small overseas operations, but for the most part, they are domestic. Now, I'm not giving you glamorous plays here. This is not sexy. But I do think that it's the way to effectively protect capital and grow capital. I will tell you, too, that I do love bonds. Now, you might say treasuries. I'm not buying treasuries at below 2%. I actually think interest rates are going lower for treasuries. But for an investor, I recommend municipal bonds as a place to receive safe, reasonable dividend. But there you have to be very careful. Which municipals? Not my home state of Illinois, not New Jersey, not New York, not California. For the most part, if you avoid the wings of the country and stick to the middle, I think you're extremely safe. From North Dakota down to Texas, I think you get very attractive yields. And for the wealthy, municipal bonds are particularly attractive because of the tax advantages. I am also still a huge fan of corporate bonds. But in all of these scenarios, too, I would caution you that I think this is an era, the post-housing crisis era, in which you must condition your mind, unless you are a trader, to be ready to earn 3, 4, 5%. I think the days of achieving double-digit returns with any reasonable degree of risk are over. Now, can you make double digits? Absolutely. If you've been an Apple, you've killed it. But again, risk adjusted, I think it is going to be incredibly difficult for regular investors to achieve returns north of 5%. So I think the goal then should be to try to get 4% and roughly in that area with a safety and a focus on not just the return on capital, but the return of capital. Now, having said that, if I'm right about China, and if the China breakup has already commenced, then we are going to see far lower equity prices globally because the world has invested so much in China. But I will also tell you this, if I'm right about that, I do not believe the S&P 500 will be anywhere near where it is now. I think it will be substantially lower. If it is, I think it will present an amazing buying opportunity because, as I've mentioned to you, as bearish as I am China, I am every bit that bullish and more long-term on the United States. So before I take some questions, I'll tell you that, to paraphrase Mark Twain, the news of America's death, particularly economically, has been very premature. While I believe that China is going to bring economic pain to the world, our children, contrary to conventional wisdom, will live in an America that is more prosperous and more globally dominant than we live in today. I mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier. I'll close with a quote of his. He said, "Whether we seek it or not, whether we like it or not, we Americans are the keepers of the miracles." Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Could you pass your questions to the middle row, and we'll have students pick them up. And while we're waiting to get those questions, Steve, I wondered if you could comment on the action that the Federal Reserve announced today. They announced a quantitative easing 3, or whatever it is that they're going to refer to, they will ultimately refer to it as. They're going to buy back mortgage-backed securities for an indefinite period of time. They've pledged to sustain and maintain low interest rates, 0 to 0.25% through 2015. The stock market went up over 200 points. Is this good or not so good? What's your opinion?
In 2 words, not good. I figured I'd get asked about this today, and it is obviously very topical. By the way, it wasn't QE3, it's QE infinity. They promised open-ended QE. To me, the greatest risk to America right now, the greatest risk, is that we are following, in many ways, the Chinese model. Now, we're nowhere near that bad, but we are creeping toward that vision of a centrally planned economy, because quantitative easing is central planning at its core. It is the government deciding the allocation of capital. And it is also an incredible distrust of the ability of American capitalism to regenerate. I believe it shows no confidence at all in the dynamism of the American economy. So I am not remotely a fan of QE. I think no one ever devalues their way to prosperity. And I would add, by the way, as much as Ben Bernanke has been trying to devalue the US dollar, lately it hasn't been working. It's been working the last few weeks, but not over the last year. The rest of the world is in such turmoil, both Europe and China. I like to say that these are 2 wings of a wounded bird. And it's very difficult for the United States to fly with these 2 wings. But they are in such dire circumstances that even despite Ben Bernanke's attempts to devalue the US dollar, lately at least, over the recent months, it has actually not been working. I would also caution that I think Bernanke is relying incredibly on the Japan model. I think he thinks that we are in a stagnation and a downwards deflationary spiral very akin to Japan since roughly 1992. I would argue that we have incredible differences from Japan, the biggest 2 being what I talked about with China. Demography, we are nowhere near in Japan's situation. Japan, by the way, talk about sad demographics. Japan is a country, the first country in history, that sells more adult diapers than baby diapers. Japan has horrific demographics, and I would add, maybe even more importantly, does not have the culture that America does economically. So I think if Bernanke would trust more in the dynamism of entrepreneurial capitalism and hold back from QE, I think we would be amazed at the results. Now, this is going to become an election issue, I think, immediately. To me, that's the more important takeaway. I did not think he would QE today. I was wrong. Lost money today. For me, the more important part going forward is, does Romney make this a centerpiece of his campaign? If he does and wins, then I believe the United States dollar soars. I think the long-term case for the American economy becomes even stronger. But does he win? And I have no clue what the answer is to that question.
How about real estate as an investment?
You know, a whole chapter of my book is saying that housing has not yet bottomed. If you want to talk about a unanimous opinion right now on Wall Street, just accept it as gospel truth. It's that housing has bottomed. Now, I think that the terrible days of housing's fierce declines are in the past. But I do not believe that housing has bottomed. The main reason, there's two main reasons. One is household formation. We just are not seeing an appreciable uptick in household formation. We've become a society, and we're creeping toward Europe here. We've become a society where it is acceptable in your 20s and 30s to live with your parents. And I'm not disparaging those who do. It may be purely out of necessity, but this is becoming a norm. And so the lack of household formation has me incredibly worried still about the housing market, even though I think the violent downticks are over. But here's the second thing that I think is more important, and this relates to the first question about Bernanke. Low interest rates, the lowest we've ever seen, the lowest, frankly, that anyone has ever seen in the United States, have not spurred material new home loan demand. We're seeing very modest upticks in new mortgage applications. We're seeing a ton of refinance, but we're not seeing new home loans. And we should be with interest rates this low. It tells me that rates are not the problem, demand is the problem.
This is an interesting question. We talk a lot about it in classes. It's that whole notion of outsourcing that's been taking place over the last several decades. If your view on China is correct, does that mean there's going to be insourcing? Are these jobs going to be coming back? If they are coming back, what sector are they going to be coming back to?
Yeah, great question. I absolutely think so. I think manufacturing, it's already started. Manufacturing is returning to the United States, and in a serious way, mainly because of robotics. Now, I think China is already losing its advantage in terms of workers anyway, just pure numerically losing its advantage. But more than that, Chinese workers have not been becoming more productive. American manufacturing workers are becoming vastly more productive, and it's primarily because of robotics. So I believe that we will see, and it's already starting, but that we will see a massive flow of manufacturing jobs back to this country. Now, they're manufacturing jobs that require enormous skill and education. It will not be possible simply with brawn, with pure muscle power, to make a good living in these kind of jobs. But my point is, those jobs, they've already started to come here, and I believe they're going to continue to come here much more. I would also point out a beneficiary of that onshoring process so far, a big beneficiary, has been Mexico. When you look at emerging markets, China has been the worst emerging market in the world. Mexico's been the best. The main reason? Proximity to the United States. It's literally next door, and it has taken advantage. China has lost its wage advantage versus Mexico. And so long term, if you want to bet on an emerging market, I'm incredibly bullish Mexico. It also has far better demographics than China.
Here's a question on commodities. It specifically asks about gold, and is the price of gold reached a bubble? But how about commodities in general? Do commodities pricing have anything to do with what you're talking about with China, the United States, and the rest of the global economy?
Yeah, well, first I will concede to you, my book came out late last year. I've been remarkably right on China. I've been remarkably wrong on gold so far. Gold continues to go nowhere but up. It had a massive day today on quantitative easing. I am not a believer in gold, but I've been dead wrong. But two reasons, and one of them is related to China, why I don't believe in gold. China has been the marginal new buyer of gold. Over the last several years, the price of gold has been very correlated to China. It has not been in recent months, but generally it has been. Demand for gold has been primarily fueled by China and India. Given how poorly both of those countries are doing right now and how poorly their markets are doing, I am not a fan of gold right here. But the second reason that I'm not a fan of gold is I do not believe that there is serious inflationary pressure in the world. I think there is so much overcapacity, and I think wages are so tepid. We got some terrible wage data out in the United States just last month. We had a 1.7% real wage increase year over year. That is the lowest we've seen since the crisis. And 1.7% compares to about twice that level pre-crisis. We were regularly seeing in the mid 3%. So typically inflation is the result of high wages. It certainly was in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. To me, we don't have a recipe for high gold prices. Now, commodities in general, I am definitely skeptical there as well. I think crude oil is particularly interesting right here. Crude oil has traded very well recently, and I think that's because of geopolitical concerns. When you have a United States ambassador killed in an oil-producing country, it produces an incredible bid beneath the oil market. But I don't think the economic fundamentals are there. Now, I'm not willing to yet bet against oil, but if we get any kind of clarity on the Middle East, which who knows if we ever will, but if we do, I think betting against commodities will actually make sense. By the way, one interesting note with commodities. So we had the worst drought in decades in the Midwest in the United States this year, skyrocketing grain prices. I think this puts China in a really precarious situation. The majority of Chinese consumers spend the majority of their money on food and energy. The fact that soy prices in particular, which is a real staple of the Chinese diet, the fact that soy prices have increased to this degree makes it very difficult for the average Chinese consumer, and it also makes it very difficult for the Chinese government to engage in what Bernanke's doing, which is some form of monetary accommodation, their form of QE. It's very hard to QE when prices are already that high for food staples that are so important to the average Chinese consumer. I think it's one of the reasons why China will disappoint, unlike Bernanke, will disappoint financial markets in terms of monetary accommodation.
Here's a fan. Somebody that watches you on Halftime and Fast Money said that sometime during the last week of August, you said, quote, "It is time to lighten up on dividend or high-yield equities. Why?"
Oh, interesting. Somebody's paying attention. I will tell you, no, at that point, I did lighten up. I'm back in now. No, right. Well, I'm a trader. It's fast money, that show. No, and listen, that's important, too. We talk about the show's called Fast Money. We have positions on Wednesday. We could be the opposite by Friday, and sometimes are. In general, I love dividend-paying stocks. And for long-term investors who are not traders, I want to be involved in domestically oriented dividend payers. At that point, if I remember correctly, and I'm on TV a lot, but if I remember correctly, at that point, they had had an incredible run. I had a fair bit of profit, took profit, and then was looking to reload lower, which I certainly did. As a matter of fact, I bought more utilities today, post-Fed announcement. And most of the time, I'm not a very good company guy. I don't buy shares of companies particularly well. I try to just buy the entire sector. So I'm much more of an ETF trader. So I bought the XLU, which is all of the utilities bundled into one today. And at least so far, it's going my way, but we'll see.
Here's an interesting question. It's actually a follow-up from your fan that watches you on Halftime and Fast Money. And I'm going to actually add on to this a bit. Can you suggest any pamphlets or books that plainly explain options, especially spreads? But I would also like you to comment on, should the average investor really be interested in derivative trading?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to completely punt on the first question. I don't know what the best book is. Do you, Professor? What would you?
We have an Investments 2 course. We teach derivatives and spreads.
But in terms of what's the best book, I'm not an options guy. I do trade a lot of options, but I rely on folks who work for me, thankfully, who are adept at that, and I am not. You can't know everything. I don't know the best textbook, but I will say this in terms of the derivatives exposure. I think active traders absolutely must be involved in derivatives. For the casual investor, no. I do not believe that they need to be involved in derivatives. Now, I will say, for very wealthy folks who can get incredibly professional, tailor-made portfolios and advice, the kind of people who can afford private client-type services, they absolutely should be taking advantage of derivative strategies. But for the normal investor, my belief is to sleep at night on corporate bonds, on municipal bonds. Boring is beautiful, and don't get hurt.
We we do have quite a few Chinese students on campus. And one of them is saying, what do you think China ought to do?
Great question. What China should do is follow the traditional American model, not the one that we've been pursuing lately, which is real free enterprise. The first concrete step toward that would be to sell its state-owned enterprises. Most major companies in China are state-owned. They should be selling those to private investors, both within China and outside of China. Now, I think one of the reasons that's extremely difficult is because the accounting is so terrible in the country of China as a whole, but particularly within state-owned enterprises. So they will have a hard time passing muster in terms of real Western-style audits of those companies. But that would be, to me, by far the most beneficial thing that China could do. It would be to start following the path of real capitalism, to start trying to foster a culture of creativity, to lift the one-child policy immediately, although frankly I think it's too late demographically, but they still should do it. And I think another key thing that China should do is to stop the bellicose attitude toward the United States, particularly if Romney wins. Romney has spoken pretty tough regarding China and trade. A trade war would be bad for the United States. It would be disastrous for China. So if I were China, I would start kissing up to Romney right now in case he wins.
What are some reasons why you're so skeptical of Wall Street?
Well, the track record is the main reason. I think that, look, Wall Street serves Wall Street's interests. And I don't think necessarily Wall Street should be faulted for that entirely. But caveat emptor, buyer beware. We need to be smart about how we approach Wall Street. I will say this too. One reason that Wall Street acts sometimes the way it does and very much contravenes the interests of regular investors is because of government meddling. So I don't put it all on Wall Street's shoulders. For instance, the housing crisis. Did Wall Street act incredibly irresponsibly the way it securitized debt that it certainly knew was terrible debt? Why did it do it? Because it had an implicit government guarantee. When the government guarantees something, the unintended consequences are almost always terrible. Now, it was a laudable goal. The government wanted widespread American home ownership. And by the way, this was bipartisan. This was George W. Bush and Bill Clinton primarily. This happened well before George Bush and obviously well before Obama. It really started in the first Bush presidency, but it gained a lot more steam under Clinton and then the second Bush 43. The idea that home ownership must be widespread, the government literally forced banks to make loans in areas where it had no business making loans, and then it said, but we will backstop you. We will be the ultimate buyer, we meaning the taxpayer, will be the ultimate buyer of all these toxic mortgages. So what did Wall Street do? It did what most rational beings would do. It took the money and said, well, sure, we'll take that profit. So I'm skeptical of Wall Street, but I also say I think government mostly makes it infinitely worse.
Last question, because this is a political season, I'm going to paraphrase the question a bit. What impact is the election going to have on the economy? And then what impact is that economy going to have on the stock market?
Yeah. You know, on this, I have some contrarian views as well. I believe that if Romney wins, for the near term, I actually think it's a pretty big market negative, because I do believe he's going to follow through on his criticisms of Bernanke. I think he's going to largely take away the sugar high that the market has so enjoyed in terms of fiscal stimulus, which is massive spending on our own version of infrastructure projects, and on the monetary side, which is quantitative easing. I think if we take that away from the market, I think there's going to be some pain in the near term. But in the long term, I firmly believe that there is so much capital on the sidelines in America that you will see an amazing, a truly stunning rally. And I mean rally in every way, in a market sense, in an economic sense. I think the animal spirits of America would be so enlivened by seeing the regulatory burden lifted and, frankly, by seeing higher interest rates at some point, that I think eventually it would be incredibly prosperous for the United States. Now, is that going to happen? As I said, I have no idea. To me, I'm not a political analyst. To me, the election seems very much like a coin flip. If Obama wins, my guess is, at least for the near term, Bernanke is going to take his QE infinity and even amplify it. So my guess is the stock market actually does reasonably well in the months following an Obama victory. But I think it might set up then for a disastrous crisis, another crisis like the housing crisis, is my view. So it is economically, certainly, you know, every election, they always say this is the most important election ever. Economically, I think it might be the most important election ever, because I do think that we are at a state right now where government intervention in the economy is at an unprecedented level in every way. And are we going to U-turn that situation, or are we going to accelerate it?
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much.